My name's Jason Partica, and I have Bud Cushman here with me, and we're going to go over the Carel control training. The big thing with this control, you want to make sure that you're paying attention to the icons outside of the control. So we will be looking at the temperature on that, obviously, but again, the big thing is going to be the compressor icon, the fan icon, if it's in defrost or not, if there's any alarms showing on there. So we want to make sure that when we're going through this control that we're paying attention to those icons outside of it there. You'll notice on the right hand side is where all the action is going to take place as far as the different buttons go. So you have your up and down arrows, your power button, your defrost button, and then the set button on these. So when you go to set the box temperature, you have to actually press and hold the set button, and then you can adjust it with the arrows and then press and hold set to save it. As far as the startup goes on these, so coolers and freezers are both going to start up in defrost. So they will, anytime you disconnect power and reconnect it, it'll go through a defrost. If you press and hold the melting snowflake button for a few seconds, it'll go in and out of defrost from there as well. And then you have the on off button there too, so you can turn it on and off from the control or unplug the unit. As far as the location of the control, it's always going to be located on the back of the unit, normally in a metal junction box. Control will be mounted sideways in there with the probes plugged into it and all the electrical connections and that coming in. As far as the wiring goes, so we'll kind of start out with the 407 there on the left-hand side. You'll notice that we have a hot gas solenoid that's going to be for defrost on that. So these ones do not have an electric heat on them. Those ones will just have the hot gas bypass on there. You have your condensing unit, line power, everything coming in, your evaporator fan. So the fans on these, basically when the unit's in a cooling mode, the fan will run. Otherwise, the fan is off. And then you'll notice the probes on that. So the probes on these, in a lot of our different models, you'll have separate probes for the evaporator coil and for the air sensor. On this one here, if one of them fails, you're actually going to be replacing both. They come together as a harness, plugs into the back of the control, and then you'll just run the probes to the appropriate location, whether it's on the suction line or in the return air on that. With the cooler, it's a little bit different. Big difference being there is the evaporator fans are going to run 24/7. As soon as you plug that unit in, the fans are going to be on. They're going to run throughout defrost. They're going to run while the unit's cooling during an off cycle. There should be no time where the evaporator fan is not running on the 406 and 4048. There is no heating element or hot gas solenoid for defrost on those. Probes are exactly the same as the freezer. As far as the operation of the temperature control and setting box temp and things of that nature. So the set point on these is where the unit will cycle off. So on a cooler, we normally set those at around 33, 34 degrees. And then the freezer, we're normally going to set those. I usually tell people set them around 0 to -2, somewhere in that particular area. So with that, the differential on that's going to be 7 degrees. So when that unit cycles off, and we'll use the cooler as an example, when the cooler cycles off at 33 degrees, it's going to come back on at 40 degrees. Same thing with the freezer. If it's set at -2, it's going to come back on at 5 above 0. As far as troubleshooting goes, so you'll notice we got a handful of different errors that appear on the right-hand side there. The big ones being the E0 and the E1. Those are the different probe errors on there for the air and coil probes. Again, with those, if you have one of those errors, it doesn't really matter as far as the other probe goes because you're going to be replacing it anyway. So since it comes with that harness. The low and high temperature alarms, you can see the different thresholds for those as far as when it'll kick off the alarms on those. EF means the unit's operating on a parameter error. ED means that the defrost ended on time rather than temperature. So that doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with the unit if you have that ED show up on the display. It just means that usually under normal operation, that unit's going to terminate defrost on temperature rather than time. So if it goes the entire time duration on that, there could potentially be an issue could be the beginnings of maybe a frozen up evaporator coil, which would maybe require a little bit more troubleshooting on that end of it. As far as the LED flashes go, so that's something that, and again, it's kind of like the ED error. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem with the unit. It just means that there's a function that hasn't been able to begin yet because something else hasn't wrapped up. So the example that we normally use is like the compressor off time, the minimum off time on that. So the example I always use is you have a cooler, it's set at 33 degrees, the unit satisfies. The second it satisfies, Bud comes in, opens the door, and a rush of hot air comes in there, and the temperature inside that cabinet goes up to 48 degrees, let's say. Well, at that point, we still haven't met that minimum compressor off time because it's only been, let's say, 20, 30 seconds at this point. So the unit has to wait for that minimum compressor off time to be met, which is usually 2 minutes. And then once that 2 minutes is up, then the unit can begin into its cooling mode. So the display will flash. Again, it doesn't necessarily mean that there's an issue with it, but it's just something to be aware of. If you do see that happening, it may be just something we may just have to wait it out for a few minutes and let the unit kind of go through its natural paces to see what happens there. So the big thing here with the 406 and 4048 as far as the cooler operation goes, so it'll initiate defrost at startup. So again, it'll you plug it in, it goes through a defrost cycle on that. The defrost on that, the times on those, so it'll be either a minimum of 1 minute and go all the way up to 75 minutes. And then but the temperature that we're normally looking for termination on that's going to be 41 degrees. So the evaporator fans are going to run all the time, again, through defrost and everything. Once that defrost is over, the control is going to call for cooling, and then the condensing unit's going to kick in. And at that point, it's going to go through its normal cooling cycle. The defrost on this, it will go through a defrost every 6 hours of actual time. So it's not based off of compressor runtime or evaporator coil temperature. It's strictly based off clock time. So the example I always use is if the unit goes into a defrost around 12 noon, it's typically going to go into a defrost again after about 6 hours of actual time. So it'll go in defrost again about 6 p.m. that night.
Yeah, if you wanted to, with it being on clock time, let's say a customer has their cooler or their freezer going into defrost at an inopportune time of their day. You can explain to them that by unplugging and plugging the unit back in, basically just reestablish power to the unit, that resets that clock. So when you plug it in, it starts counting down those 6 hours. So if they're having an issue where their cooler is going into defrost mode at, say, noon when they're in their busiest time, you can explain to them to disconnect and reconnect power at, say, 9, 10 o'clock in the morning. That will get their defrost be the window well beyond their lunchtime, in between lunch and dinner. That way your unit is not entering that defrost mode at your most inopportune times.
The next point here, so the third one from the bottom, if you're following along here, is kind of the big one here. And I'll let Bud explain this one here as far as the defrost, how it operates on there on the display.
Yeah, when your control initiates a defrost, it will lock in the last temperature of the cabinet. So let's say our cabinet at 406, we're at 35 degrees when it initiates a defrost. That 35 degrees is going to remain on your display until that defrost has satisfied and the next cooling cycle has also satisfied. So normal operation, nobody would ever even notice that it happened. But if you're a tech out there servicing the unit, obviously you have it powered off, you're working on it, the cabinet gets up to room temperature, and then you go back to you finish your work, you get the unit power back on, your compressor kicks on, begins to cool. But you see the cabinet temperature is dropping, but your display temp remains at ambient temperatures. That is something, again, you just want to keep in mind. When you initiate a defrost, that last known temperature, regardless of what that temperature is, will remain on that display until the defrost cycle and the next cooling cycle has satisfied. Once that next cooling cycle satisfies, that is when you will start to see the actual cabinet temperature being reflected on the screen.
All right, and then so from there too, also then with the control, with the cooler, notice the minimum and maximum temperatures there. These can be set all the way up to 50 degrees or down to 28. As far as the freezers go, so obviously a little bit different operation as we mentioned before. As far as the fans go, the fans will not run during defrost. So even though this unit has a hot gas defrost and the compressor is running, the evaporator fans do not run during the defrost. So they'll only run when the unit is calling for cooling. So we'll go through defrost. The defrost can last anywhere from a minute up to around 35 minutes. We're looking for a 75-degree line temp on those as far as coil temp goes. So that hot gas defrost works really well. That will keep the lines nice and warm. So under normal operation on those, a typical defrost is probably going to be in that 10 to 15-minute range, assuming everything's operating normally on that. So once that defrost is over, and whether it terminates by time or temperature, you'll have a 3-minute drip time where essentially nothing will be happening there. The unit's just going to be allowing that coil to drip with the water that's melted off of it there, allowed to drip off. From there, there'll be a call for cooling. Condensing unit kicks in, evaporator fan kicks in, and the unit begins cooling. The defrost on this, pretty similar to a refrigerator, but the time's a little bit different on this. It's going to actually initiate a defrost every 5 hours of clock time. So again, nothing based off coil temperature, nothing based off of compressor runtime, anything like that. So again, the example again using if the unit goes into a defrost around 12 noon, it's going to go into a defrost again roughly around 5 p.m. that afternoon. And then again, you'll see those different set points there. This one can be set all the way down to -15. I don't really see a scenario where you probably want to set it that low just because you're going to have some pretty increased run times there. So normally, again, if you're giving me and Bud a call, we're normally going to tell you probably set that thing around 0 degrees, maybe down to -2 or so. And that's typically where we'd want to see those set. As far as probe locations go, so we have the 2 probes on these. Again, they'll be on that harness. You have the air sensor. It's going to be located behind the evaporator cover. It's typically a small little plastic clip that it goes into. The defrost probe on this isn't actually a true coil probe. It actually mounts to the suction line. So you won't find it in the evaporator coil. However, some of the coolers, we've had some instances where we've had some frozen up evaporators, and we've been having techs relocate those probes from that suction line to the evaporator coil to help with defrost on that. So if you happen to see a coil that's maybe frosting up a little bit more than normal and everything else seems to be operating correctly, it might not be a bad idea to relocate that probe from that suction line over to the evaporator coil. As far as resistance goes on these, so these ones you can stick them in some ice water, check the resistance, should be about 26 to 28K at 32 degrees. Not all ice water is created equal, so you're going to probably have a little bit of variance, so that's why we allow that bit of a range there.